Good evening. My name is Emily Towns, and I'm Dean of Vanderbilt Divinity School. Tonight, the Divinity School is bringing you the Harrod Lecture that was established to honor Harrod, the Oberlin Alumni Professor of Social Ethics and Sociology of Religion. Professor Harrod, who died in 2003, was on our faculty for some 34 years. He wrote widely, with several books devoted to ethics and to Native American religions and cultures. The Harrod Lectures, which began in 2004, are intended to deal with aspects within any of the three general fields of Harrod's interest: social ethics, sociology of religion, and Native American religions and cultures. This year's Harrod Lecture is Laurel C. Schneider, Professor of Religious Studies and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies here at Vanderbilt University. She is a former student of Harrod's, whose interests lay in modern and postmodern Christian thought, gender theory, sociology of religion, traditional dogmatic approaches to religious questions in the Christian tradition. She introduces potential openings and movement from other sources. Her single-authored books include Reimagining the Divine, Confronting the Backlash Against Feminist Theology, 1998, and Beyond Monotheism, A Theology of Multiplicity, in 2007. Her co-edited works are Polydoxy, Theology of Multiplicity and Relation in 2010, and Awake to the Moment, Introducing Constructive Theology in 2016. Due April of next year, according to Amazon, the knower of all things books, is her co-written Queer Soul and Queer Theology, Ethics and Redemption in Real Life, authored with Nikki Young. Tonight, she returns to her work in Native American Studies. The title of her lecture, When the Book is a Hare, What the Study of Some First Nations Traditions Teaches Me About Christian Theology. Following her lecture, we will have a question and answer period. I ask Dr. Schneider to come to the screen. That was great.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I need to get my talk ready here. Didn't know that I didn't have it ready. So thank you, Dean Towns, for that introduction. And thank you, Vanderbilt Divinity School, for the invitation to deliver this year's Harrod Lecture. As some of you may know, and as you heard from Dean Towns, Howard was a true mentor to me in my own graduate education, both as a scholar of multiple interests and passions and as a model for navigating the sometimes tricky political waters of advanced graduate education and the idiosyncrasies of faculty management. Although I studied Native American traditions in college and had many personal reasons for my continuing interest, My work with Howard Harrod is a principal reason that the indigenous traditions of Native North America entered into my theological, philosophical, and sociological scholarship. He tapped me multiple times as his teaching assistant in that field as I worked on and through my theological degree here at Vanderbilt. When he died, the course in Native American religious traditions that he developed and regularly taught here left Vanderbilt with him. But he had asked me to take the class over a mere week into its start when he was first diagnosed with cancer. Because of that, I took the course with me when I left to teach elsewhere. Like a story that lives and breathes in those who carry it, I continued to teach and adapt it as my scholarship in the area deepened over the years. It was therefore quite an emotional homecoming for me in 2013 when I returned to Vanderbilt, this time as a professor, and brought his course back as well. I still have the fading Xerox church and lived community was in the Blackfoot lands of what is now Montana. Mine have been focused on the southeastern and northeastern coastal nations where I was raised and have lived. But I thank you, Howard, for that risk you took, gifting me with responsibility for stories and teaching that came from the center of your heart and scholarly passion. I walk in your path, or try to. So to begin, and there are several beginnings here, there are some preliminary clarifications and acknowledgements that I need to make. The first about my association with American Indian Studies, and the second regarding acknowledgement of the people. Let me start with the second, because proper greetings should always come first. It is customary among American Indian scholars to greet and acknowledge the peoples and ancestors into whose lands they travel. It is strange, giving this talk in the middle of a pandemic surge, to talk about traveling to places and greeting peoples and ancestors when it's cyberspace that holds us together here tonight. But each of us is, nevertheless, in a real, alive place. And I am visiting you there and greet the peoples whose stories and traditions that fed that land, who lived respectfully in, on, and with that land, and who consider that place where you are now a relative. I therefore wish to pause here to offer this moment for each of us to acknowledge with me the living land that holds us patiently beneath our feet, each a place of long human history and relation. If you do not know where you are, whose relative is caring for you, or stories of the people for whom it was and still is a relation, I encourage you to find out. To recognize the sovereignty of the native peoples of this place in the aftermath of so many broken treaties, genocidal forced removals, political betrayals, and ongoing disenfranchisements even today, is, I believe, vital to any and every scholarly or gathering event. This courtesy of remembrance also serves a pedagogical effort to counter historical amnesia. So I bring you greetings from what is now called Nashville on the Cumberland River Plateau, which is the traditional and shared hunting lands of the Tsoyaha or Yuchi people, the Tsalagi or Cherokee people, the Shawanawa or the Shawnee people, and others. Those are nations who, amazingly, did not even share language family origins, unlike the different Europeans who took over the land. This means that their worldviews were vastly different, their sciences too. Diplomacy was therefore always a critical and valued technique for navigating each people's real relations with the land that they shared and the many and varied nations of people, by which I mean animal, vegetable, and mineral people, who had homes here. The fabled Natchez Trace runs nearby from where I'm sitting, from the river a mile north, past where I am sitting here to the Gulf of Mexico, a road so ancient it remembers more than any history book could hold. And in places south of here, it is worn so deep into the land that the sides tower above human heads. Before De Soto introduced Europe to many of the peoples here by pillaging his way across what is now Florida, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, the human and other than human peoples of these lands were not just residents, like modern owners of property. This land was not desacralized that way. It was not transferable like a thing. This land had and has relatives. The land holding you patiently in place right now had and has relatives. No place, we must first understand, is the same as territory or map. More on that later. No living place is commodifiable, transferable, neutral, and every place is living. That's the first thing. Next, an important clarification. I must make plain that I am a scholar of certain American Indian religious traditions, but am not an enrolled citizen of any indigenous nation. This makes a difference in the authority I do not have to represent any of the cultures and traditions I study, or to speak for the elders to whom I have listened and from whom I have learned. Of course, non-members descendant of any is a necessary clarification in reference to this talk, not only because of those communities. I will come back to that last point, though I've already gestured toward it in speaking of the lands south of the Cumberland River. What I mean here is that I take up the position of student of these traditions, much in the same way that I have ever taken up the position of student of any published philosophical or theological or ethnographic material. My interpretation and use of these public domain materials represents a process of learning that is not absolute or closed. But the result is never a representation of the people and their traditions. I have to say that again. I restrict myself to public domain materials and treat them as sources of learning, not to become a member of the culture or community from which they come, but to accept the gift of education that will inevitably change my own thinking, enter into my understanding in ways that cannot be foreseen. Because I am concerned to decolonize my own thinking and work to recognize misappropriation wherever possible, treating the writings of indigenous philosophers as offerings to a world that is desperately in need of them, to see how my own understanding can be developed in a mode of respect as a result. But Thomas Norton Smith, a Shawnee philosopher, puts it best, I think. Quote, "Know well," he says in the introduction to his interpretation of American Indian philosophy, "know well that I will say nothing that a diligent scholar couldn't find somewhere in print. For the rest belongs to the people, and it is not my place to share it." As a theologian of the Christian tradition, I believe that it is my obligation to stay attentive to a long and devastating history of assault and domination carried out in the name of Christian missions and European civilization upon indigenous peoples of this continent and elsewhere. Christianity's willing alliance with the gold, then cotton, then land obsessions of Europe's settler colonizers and wealth accumulators is a fact of history that, as Willie James Jennings has so carefully noted, given shape to Christian imagination itself. The Christian arguments for the removals of whole peoples from their relatives in the land, for the brutal enslavement of entire categories of people, for the forced separations of children from their families in the name of Christian education and civilization, are not just unfortunate details of a violent colonial past. Indeed, they are still going on, as we know. The theological contortions required to legitimate those practices were stories the Christian colonizers told themselves as they looked away from the suffering they inflicted in pursuit of massive Trump-like wealth from sugar, rice, and cotton. These Christians told stories to themselves to enable them to desacralize the land, march long, rattling coffles of enslaved persons already amputated from their place-based relations in Africa, right through this town, down the Natchez Trace to the cotton camps of the Delta. They marched in the wake of similarly forced marches of Cherokee, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Yuchi, Shawnee, Coasati, Quapaw, and so many other peoples west to foreign lands, foreign trees, foreign winds, severed under Andrew Jackson's watchful guns from their own places of emergence, relation, and meaning, away from the circularity of those relations that went through their feet into the earth and mountains that encircled them, through their arms into the rivers, trees, and animals, through their heads into the winds that fed the rain. The circles of their places, this land, was broken and straightened in a line westward into exile. The theological story that enabled the settlers to do this, in part, was one of a linear path to God, a manifest destiny, a chain of being that went in a straight line through the lesser beings, the savages, to the civilized beings, to God. Linearity is a feature of European thought and Christian theological imagination that was concretized in the colonial centuries in a particular way. What, I ask, would a less linear theological imagination enable, be, and do? Thomas King, a Cherokee writer, has said, quote, "The truth about stories is that's all we are." What Willie James Jennings has argued persuasively to my mind is that not only the brutal colonial history is not in the past, not only is it not in the past, it has entered into and shaped what he calls Christian imagination generally at some of its most fundamental levels. This is a Christian imagination that accommodates settler colonialism in a variety of ways. The first is that it has told stories that it has become. It has told stories that it has become, to make that colonialism and its amputations of relations possible. The second is that it privileges one ethnic character of theology and doctrine over all others, tacitly promulgating both a superiority and a supersessionist aspect of European cultural patterns of thought to theological inquiry and doctrinal assertion. One effect of this long-standing cultural parochialism in theology is the importation of an anti-materialism that rationalizes and legitimates in its conceptualization of God a piety that must support spirit that is separable, that can be abstracted and abstractable from bodies and from land and from all of its relatives. This anti-materialist intellectual framework supports a piety, a Christian imagination of settler colonialism that can pick up and move as lands and places and people becomes desacralized things, things abstractable and transferable, things ownable. Of all sorts were made for flight and separation from place. The very nature of modern Christian theological thinking and argumentation shaped itself around the European shift to whiteness in the race for wealth in gold, land, and human bodies. The confusion of Christianity with civilization in that effort made both sides of that coin, civilization and Christianity, participate in winning the trifecta of Indian removal, land acquisition, and wealth accumulation through enslaved labor. So it is a delicate matter, learning from others without indulging in acquisitive colonizing habits, especially in the global context of this enwhitened Euro-Christian cultural domination. Those of us who work to undo some of the harms of that historical assault while not relinquishing our religious inheritance in Christian faith, not throwing the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, is no small task, given the enormity and complexity of that history and the resilience of settler colonial dynamics, even in the present. It is, nevertheless, an obligation that I think Christians of all sorts and backgrounds adopt a posture of learning in relation to the indigenous traditions so recently reviled and assaulted. This is an obligation not for the purpose of acquisition or conversion of others, but for the spiritual discipline of being converted from the narrow strictures of ethnocentric supremacy, even when it rides incognito in our most sincere and passionate commitments. For theologians in particular, I contend that this means being converted.
Laurel.
Is that the cultural shape of Christian theological argument as it emerged from the medieval period forward, but especially in the rise of the so-called Age of Reason, conforms to a powerful mode of critical rationality that disavows its own ethnic parochialism, designating all other modes of rationality as ethnically parochial. Indeed, this mode of reasoning describes the shape of modern academic critical thought in every discipline across the university. The point here that I want to make is not that the European heritage of modern theological reasoning is bad in itself. Quite the contrary. It is the methodological basis for the very critical analysis I'm undertaking here. But as a key player in the history of colonization, that European intellectual heritage errs in privileging its own mode as the foundation of all other forms of reasoning, all other possibilities for getting at what counts as true knowledge. True knowledge. Now that's a question for the ages. From my own study of the Eastern woodland traditions of the First Nations in this land, I have had to recognize that true knowledge is always a story. And stories are themselves other than human persons in their own right, walking around, inserting themselves into polite society, sometimes creating worlds, often messing things up. The trickster stories teach the people that there are always consequences and that relations are at the center of meaning and right relation. They also teach that because the world is built on interaction and interactions never come out the same way twice, that interaction is the basis of relation. Hare, or rabbit, shows up often in eastern woodlands, trying to get away with mischief, and in doing so, giving lasting shape to the land and its peoples. He is Nanabotso, or Nanabush in Ojibwe nations, Jistu in Cherokee, Cholfi in Creek. In the Plains traditions, he is also often Coyote, but he is a shapeshifter and can show up in human form, even in Washington. He's annoying, brash, and greedy, always out for himself, but always part of the circle of relations that make up the world. He cannot be excised from it, and he is central to its formation. His mistakes are big, but we come to understand they are our mistakes. In his amazing novel called Green Grass, Running Water, Thomas King has a vignette in which Coyote, the emblematic trickster figure of the Plains nations, has a dream. Now, the dream that Coyote is having reads much like a riff. In fact, it is a riff on the Genesis story of creation, sort of. In the beginning, King tells us, there was nothing. Okay, familiar enough. But the very next sentence starts to stretch the familiar while then we find out that Coyote is there at the beginning too. Really not nothing. Coyote is asleep and dreaming. And King tells us his dream gets loose and starts running around. His dream starts shouting, "Hooray, I'm in charge of the world." His dream makes a lot of noise, we're told, wakes Coyote up, which of course distracts the silly dream. "Who are you?" the dream asks Coyote. "I'm Coyote," he says, "and I'm very smart." "Then I'm Coyote too," says the dream. "No," Coyote tells him, "you can't be Coyote. I'm Coyote, but you could be a dog." The dream ponders this, then accepts it. But being a dream and being silly, in its eagerness, it gets it all backwards. At this point, King, the narrator, says, uh-oh. Here we are at the beginning, and there's Coyote, water, a dream, and a mistake. What is dog spelled backwards? The dream is happy for a moment that it has become a dog, a god. Then it demands more. The dialogue goes like this. "But why am I a little god?" shouts that god. See the little god, right? Dog spelled backwards. "Why am I a little god?" shouts that god. "Not so loud," says Coyote. "You're hurting my ears." "I don't want to be a little god," says that god. "I want to be a big god." "What a noise," says Coyote. Just stop shouting." "There," says that God. "That's better." "Now you've done it," King, the narrator, says. Everything's under control," says Coyote. "Don't panic." So this is a story. This is not scripture, right? Nor is it even what might qualify in any of the traditions of the Americas as a story of power, a sacred story. It's a novel. It's part of a novel, and it's a joke. But it gives us a glimpse of the way that stories of creation are sometimes shaped. Error is built in, so is humor. Coyote or Hare is not all bad, not all good, just true in the way that living is always just a bit flawed, often a bit funny, and sometimes very poignant. So what do I mean by the title of this talk tonight, when the book is a hare? In part, I mean just what it says. For Christian theologians, the book is usually the Bible, but it's also the Summa Theologica, the Church Dogmatics, the Westminster Confession. It is the Institutes. It is God of the oppressed. There are two questions for me as a theologian embedded here. What happens to theology when it is written down? And what is theology when it gets loose and runs around, claiming to rule the world? I used to think in my study of North American indigenous traditions that writing killed stories, that orality is necessary to the personhood of stories. In part, I think that's probably accurate in some of the differences between what writing does and what orality does in culture. But only partly true, because now I think I understand, like Willie James Jennings, that writing is another kind of trickster. They become stories, but without place or time. They can still get loose and run around looking for a home, looking for relatives. This insight challenges me greatly, especially as I am a writer, a lover of writing, and do not intend to suggest that writing itself is the problem. Indeed, I am dependent on writing for the learning that I am talking about tonight in terms of indigenous philosophers who are writing. Understanding the animism of story, the personhood of story, even when it is bound in a multi-volume tome of dogmatic theology, may be more what I'm after here. As you know, most of the cultures native to the North American continent did not traditionally use writing to communicate, keep, or preserve records, or to pass on wisdom, ritual knowledge, and other matters central to the life of the people. All do now, either in English, Spanish, or in syllabaries of native languages the people themselves have created. it is clear that what we call religious traditions in many American Indian contexts are historically shaped in ways other than through the conformity that writing imposes on stories or scripture or sacred text. Howard Harrod would talk about the resilient adaptability that orality gives to a spiritual practice, to a religious practice, and to an oral tradition. Stories and songs evolve in context and so live that way, having efficacy of their own, a kind of personality or living autonomy. Stories and songs work back on those who sing them, back on those who receive them. Stories get loose and run around changing things. I was told once, you'd better be careful with telling a story. Know what its season is, know what its time is, and know what its place is. This fact alone has an enormous effect on the challenges and possibilities of theology that loosens its grip on writing and loosens its grip on the precedents of text in order to learn from or accept the possibility that there is more going on in everyday orality than a mere exchange of words that could otherwise be written down. Perhaps an analogy would help. A map shows us a place, correct? Yes and no. A map is a schema intended to represent a place, even orient one to a place, but it is not the place. In fact, it neutralizes places and is effective because it does so, placing things on grids, schematizing them in orientation to what it is not. Confusing maps and places can lead to big God mistakes, like when the Mormon settlers overlaid a map of Israel on the Salt Lake Valley, orienting themselves away from where they were. Mistaking maps for places is something Hare would certainly do and does. Perhaps it's what all of us glued to our televisions these past few days have done. The point is, we can write things down, but just as a map cannot write the elements, stories, and other than human persons that really make up places, that are the relatives of places, writing cannot reproduce the ontology involved in real stories. It cannot contain the relations that words have to whole stories told in season, in the right place, no, from the right place, in the right mind, and in a living context of temporal relations. This gets at the power stories have to make and unmake worlds. Stories without a place are dangerous. Stories without a context can run around and get in charge of the world. Stories and songs in their performance, in their being, cannot be dissected into words or phrases or passages. They can be written down, but then they are no longer stories of power, no longer relevant to the question of theology, which we might say is fundamentally concerned with stories of power. Perhaps what I'm trying to say is that Christian theology's privileging of written texts, combined with the parochial overlay of Euro-German rationality, has desiccated theological inquiry, reducing much of it to an exercise in map making that mistakes itself for the places it tries to describe. In 2014, Michaeline Pazantaby, a Chickasaw religious studies scholar, gave the Harrod Lecture here at Vanderbilt. She began with a quote from Harrod's book, The Animals Came Dancing, Native American Sacred Ecology and Animal Kinship, that although colonization severely undermined or even destroyed particular Native American social worlds and meanings, Native American cultural identity and religious understanding have created like the frog that goes dormant during times of drought and returns with the first drops of rain, the revitalization of one dormant element of Native culture also has the potential to revive numerous other elements. Imagine, if you will, the dormant frog coming up out of the once dry creek bottom. You not only see the frogs hopping everywhere, you hear the music of their chirps and croaks. Love is in the air as males serenade the females, and soon little tadpoles are swimming everywhere. A new generation of life is born. So too with culture. It is the living relation of practice to memory to culture, which is an ecology, and to life that matters. It is the specific frog itself, not what I am saying about it, that matters to the whole. Its spring emergence from the mud, its piping call, its motion, its life that signals the life of the snake who needs it to live. If I mistake the writing for the frog. Norton Smith suggests that one element of Shawnee epistemology that is worth thinking about here is what he calls semantic potency, which I take to mean the invocational power of our stories and songs to take flight and bring life or destroy it. The slow disenchantment of I take heart from Pazantabi's confidence in the frog's ability to revitalize an entire ecosystem, just as she takes heart from it in her own work on returning the bison to health as the fragment that can bring the whole people back to health. Can we theologians learn something from this in our own work? Ask where we mistake the map for the place, where we confuse disenchantment for rationality. Generalizations, and so suffer the limitations of all generalizations in relation to religion and culture. A good number of American Indian philosophers have suggested versions of these four concepts. I smile at this. We Christian theologians often fall into the groove of threes. And the fourth which extend far beyond human beings. The life of the people depends in many cases on diplomatic relations with other peoples, especially including other than human persons. The recognition that personhood is not restricted to humans or even to animals changes everything when you think about it theologically. The world is alive and in relation. Terms of relation for everything that interacts with you. Terms of relation exist for everything that interacts with you. Grandfather, auntie, cousin. These describe relation, personhood, and place, and they imply story. Each relation comes about somehow. Each relation has a story. I heard an elder candomblé herbalist in Brazil tell a group of us focus. The next time a plant brushes you as you walk past, she said, or a stone catches your toe, don't just kick it aside. Don't just push it away. Stop and be open to what it might be trying to tell you, how it might be trying to help you. The Cherokee have stories about a war that broke out between the animals and humans. The war started when the humans stopped respecting their neighboring animal nations when they were hunting. In other words, they did not acknowledge properly their relations. The war accelerated, as wars do. It became an arms race of sorts, the animals developing toxins and poisons for bites and stings to kill off the humans. It was looking bad for the humans who really couldn't hold their own much anyway. Some plants took pity on them and decided to offer their healing help, to bind their wounds, to extract the toxins. In doing so, they also helped to bring an end to the war, helped the humans to recognize from that point their dependence on the goodwill of all the peoples around them, not just their own kind. In an epistemology of relation, something is first the sum of its relations, which includes its place, what some would call context, so long as context doesn't get too abstract, which it sometimes does in theology now. The challenge of this epistemological posture, that the challenge that it poses to theology, is that really nothing can be ultimately abstracted. Nothing is true outside of its place, away from its relations, even those less than savory relations that we all have. This means also that a principle of relatedness is the basis of knowledge. Martin Buber wrote in his beautiful book, I and Thou, in the beginning was the relation. I think he understood this principle. Of the 500 nations, traditions emerge from the cracked urban pavements and reservation dust and begin again and again and again to sing a song that invites stories of relation, of slapstick beginnings, a cacophonous zoology, mineralogy, climatology, and astrology of persons, of right relations and resacralized places. If we sit and learn without taking what is not freely given, perhaps then we theologians can begin to learn to hear the fragments of a Christian story we could have been, and learn to tell a story that we can become, a story that puts us in our place, in the family of stories that the many peoples are. Thank you.
Dean Towns and Laurel, we have one question. The question reads, I am interested in what Dr. Schneider is saying about the place importance of story. What implications does this have for us as we listen to the parables of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels? I am particularly interested in the enigmatic parable of the wise and foolish bridesmaids in this week's lectionary. What problems and what opportunities do we encounter when we listen to these stories with 21st century ears?
Somebody's trying to write a sermon. I do think that what we have in the Bible is this incredible storehouse of stories, right? An incredible, rich record of stories that people told in their place. I think because the idea that I am working with, that has come to me through the study of these traditions, is that stories themselves have personhood, right? Stories themselves stories are not just something I tell that's inert And, I might tell you a story and you're like, oh, okay, well, that's a good story. And then you forget it. That stories also have their own agency to some extent. And that's a really hard thing for those of us shaped in the Western mindset to even entertain as a possibility. So in terms of the parables, I think you have to ask the question, what is the energy of this story? What is it telling you? Give the story its own agency to inform you of something, and treat it in a sense with the respect that any story being retold needs to have. So, it's a story, tell it, but be aware of its power in relation to telling it. I'm who's listening, who's in the audience, who are you sharing that story with? In a sense, what we have is this written storehouse of stories, but they cannot be applied willy-nilly as if there is no context that they go into. What is the context of the community in which you might share that story? Then it becomes a story in a place, and it becomes a part of that place. And what is its proper place in that place, if that makes sense? That's what I mean.
Thank you. One more question. Along similar lines, are there ethical practices that you employ when considering telling stories?
Yeah. Well, the quote that I read from Thomas Norton Smith, Shawnee philosopher, who writes in his introduction that, everything in his published book can be found in print and the rest belongs to the people, is also to acknowledge, there are stories I did not tell tonight and that I will not tell, that I have been told. I've been given those in a sense, but not given those to tell. I've been given those as gifts to me. So in part, I think that the ethics of storytelling is it certainly in a traditional context of the traditions I'm familiar with is asking permission. Is asking permission of those to whom the story belongs. And we can think about this as, as good ethical behavior, in everyday life. If you tell me something about yourself and I think it's pretty juicy and it'd be really fun to tell somebody else, well, the ethical thing for me to do would be to ask your permission. And are you doing that for some kind of pleasure for yourself, knowing that it might potentially harm someone? That's your ethical responsibility as well. In many of the traditions that I have studied, there are stories that are tied to ritual processes, and those stories have such power that, and there are only certain persons who can tell them. And if they are told out of season, they will do great damage, to the climate. They will do damage to, so also recognizing, the power of story. Not all stories are the same, have the same kind of power. That's why I told the story out of Thomas King's book. That's a story that, edges on something I probably shouldn't tell, but he's made it into a playful, shareable story.
Thank you. We have a question from Dr. Armour. A follow-up question from a fellow theologian. Most recently, theologians have focused on who, but less so where. But where seems to show up regardless. How should theologians be more attentive to the where as well as the who? And what might change about theology were we to do with that?
Yeah, that's kind of my, that's one of my principal questions that I'm working with in this paper is we have been shaped, and when I say we, I'm doing a kind of rhetorical thing about Western Christian theological training and culture. So you can exempt yourself from the we that I'm suggesting, but generally the way that we have been shaped is to neutralize space and place. And I think there's a history to that. There are reasons for that have everything to do with the ways that this country was founded and formed, also with what happened in the development of European thought generally, that place is desacralized. And we can go to the theological frame that sets God in absolute opposition to the world and in absolute opposition to earth, as a way to define God. God is not that, such that then it becomes very difficult as theologians to resacralize the earth in a way that is that gives it life everywhere. The Catholic traditions have been better about retaining at least some sense of a sacralized place. And that's, I think, something Protestants just really did away with. So part of the question, I think, of bringing place back in is going at the basic structure of the God-world relation. What is the God-world relation such that the world is deadened and is turned into a thing that God fashions, or that God providentially maintains, but that is, fundamentally a thing, and how that works then in capitalism and the ultimate commodification of place. That many Americans have no idea even where they are. Right? Live our lives moving through space as if it was transferable to some other place, and actually get annoyed, if it's not. Right, of some sense of its personhood, of its status and I think that is unbelievably difficult for us to get our heads around, because it is so foreign to the theological practice of establishing God and spirit as anti-material. And so to materialize that starts to smack of pantheism or animism, or whatever sort of boogeyman words Christians like to use to maintain that absolute separation. Does that get at your question at all, Dr. Armour?
She does have a follow-up statement.
Of course she does.
She says, yes, but I'm thinking of those of us who resist that narrative. So Mutarista theology, Black theology, queer theology, to give names, Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, Dolores Williams, and more. So do you have more to kind of expand on given that statement from Dr. Armour?
Yeah, and let me just say, I adore Dr. Armour. So I do think that those kinds of theology are working to break open the methodologies as well as the sources for theological inquiry, and taking up the question of the body, taking up questions of maybe of place, a little bit more in terms of just, as you say, the who, who to whom do theologians listen, right? To what kinds of stories do theologians listen as authorized and authorizable sources for theological inquiry? Those kinds of works and womanist work that in a sense started around the question of literature, breaking open the possibility of that kind of approach to revelatory material, even, you know, asking the question of what is scripture. So I do think that's happening, right? I think it's a beginning that is happening. Part of what I wanted to indicate in this talk is the ways, and we know this all too well, the ways that those approaches are marginalized, are made into ethnic and therefore parochial approaches, as if the standard mode of theological inquiry is not ethnically parochial, right? So that these become interesting side routes and interesting ways of being, but, you know, it's really for them over there. Really wanting to, we all of us who are doing those kinds of works want to challenge that dominant narrative, and are attempting to do so.
A question from Facebook. Can stories change or have a different impact when told in different languages? Oh, we can't. Could you hear me?
Did I end up going mute? I was still talking.
Well, it's kind of been a little blotchy a little bit, but can stories?
Yeah, my answer to that question is yes. Yes, they have to. I mean, where you tell a story and how you tell a story and to whom you tell a story, all of those change the story. Again, you know, if we think of stories like we think of persons, you know, I'm different in different circles of people. There's, you know, it changes me to be in different situations. Maybe not fundamentally, but there is difference in that. And so, you know, the language that a story is told in, absolutely. I mean, for example, to tell a story in the Anishinaabe language is, it's virtually impossible to describe anything except in motion. So let me give an example. So Dr. Town's outfit here is not blue, it's bluing. Right? It is in a process of being and becoming blue, which means it could also be and become something else. Every noun in that language is expressed in a way that is not static. Well, that changes everything. I mean, how do you tell a story and not be able to use static nouns? If you can't use static nouns, if all your nouns are motions, then that's going to have an effect on what you hear. It's going to have an effect on what you understand. So I think that's a kind of example, a kind of extreme, perhaps an extreme example of my short answer, which is yes.
We have two more questions. This comes from Rachel Heath. Dr. Schneider, can you discuss more about telling stories when there is no agreement about who our relations are, what our shared place is, and or when the place is both materially experienced and also abstract at the same time? I have in mind what's happening currently in our political context, where different stories about democracy and our election are being weaved even in this moment. And regarding place, the United States is both experience and also an abstract context. How should theologians respond to this?
Well, I don't think there's one answer to that. I mean, I think it's a wonderful question. But, you know, I'm trying to think of what some people I have learned from, would say to that. I mean, there's never one answer to any question. And there are a lot of malicious stories coming to life. And so I think the obligation is not to just shout louder, is not to try to overwhelm with, but is to be discerning and figure out when speech is necessary and when it is better to not give more oxygen to the system, to a toxic system. Which I'm not saying that therefore then you just you back out of it, but right now I do think good stories need to be told, and I do think that encouragement is needed. The frog is not just metaphorical here, with the fragments of life and of commitment to civility, of practicing what we preach, regardless of what others might be doing, it's the only way I can imagine through this, to come through in a right mind, to have what one Greek elder called the good mind, or a smooth mind. To have a smooth mind is to not be in conflict over, basically over the kind of mess of competing stories that are at war.
To follow up,
that's not a very satisfactory answer to me, but it also is. It's also, I mean, part of what I'm saying is that nothing can be answered abstractly in a large sense. It has to do with the place and the people who are involved in the moment, not with what is the answer to this large problem kind of universally in the United States of America, where all this mess is happening. I think it's a local question, or it's a local issue. The telling of stories is local, and our participation in stories need to be in a sense of locality, because I can't answer for the country.
Just to follow up with that, there's a question: what are some of the contemporary books that we could look to for wisdom in this political moment?
Some of the contemporary, what was the word?
Books.
I think there are, well, because I'm talking about indigenous traditions and the public material that's in indigenous traditions, I think there are some wonderful resources on kind of questions of civility and conflict and culture that come out of the Haudenosaunee world, because of the importance of diplomacy and the long process of democratic process that shaped that confederacy. There's some good histories. Off the top of my head, I'm sorry, I can't name things because I'm not in my office at school, because I'm working remotely. So it's like not so sure. There is a really interesting article that I would be happy to dig out and make available, that I found by a Canadian Native scholar on the Canadian, on the Algonquin.
Laurel. Can you repeat that just again? It went out as you were talking about the Canadian scholar, as you were naming the scholar.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I seem to have an uneven internet. Yeah, my internet connection. I keep getting a message that it's unstable. So I'm very sorry. There is there's an article by a Canadian Algonquin educator on the tradition. I don't have the title in my head, but I could email it. I could make it available by email, but it takes up the tradition of a monster called a Wendigo, and Wendigos eat souls, right? They eat brains. They're kind of, they're kind of zombie. And what this scholar has done is develop a way of talking about the Wendigo that is the spirit of racism, right? Is, instead of it being this kind of mythical figure that you can, draw pictures of or scare children with, it's a way of understanding how our souls get eaten by the monster, by this monster, right? And how the monster needs to eat your soul in order to, to grow and to get bigger, and how it does. And it's a really wonderful way of telling a story that also helps us see in our lives the way that it works. So when you ask about readings and ways to deal with today, my mind goes to that, but I don't have my reference to it right here. I can, Shatika can tell me how I can make that available.
We can send it out to the group that's registered for.
But I do also, I mean, I recommend some of these books that I referred to this evening. Thomas Norton Smith's The Dance of Person and Place is I think very, very good. Donald Fixaco's A Creek Philosopher, The American Indian Mind in a Linear World. I mean, but these are philosophies, right? These are works that are trying to get at some of these characteristics of their traditions. It's not so much about kind of how do we live through this really terrifying moment right now. I think we figure out how to tell the stories that have already been given to us, right? Everyone has stories that help. Everyone has stories that encourage, and have stories that teach. And that's what I think we need to be focusing on, is telling stories that encourage, telling stories that teach, telling stories that, that help us to laugh at ourselves, help us to laugh at the mistakes that we make, help us to laugh at the mistakes that the people we're so enraged at make. I mean, I think there is something in these, these communities of this land that are profoundly educational. So long as we don't go at it, and by we, I'm talking about white people, don't go at it in a kind of acquisitive, Wendigo way.
We have one more question.
Okay.
It reads, "Thank you for this incredibly rich lecture. I'm wondering if stories have personhood and are situated in place. Then if we don't know a place or a land's story, can we have right relationship with it?"
Well, I think that some would say no, right? Some would be that the colonized circumstance would say no. I haven't ever heard any person who is part of an American Indian community ever say no, but instead to say start listening. The stories of the people of the specific place may only be remembered in the roots of the trees, but and so you may never be given the gift of some specific stories. But if you start, what I have been told, if you take the trouble to listen to languages you're not familiar with in the place that you're in, you may not know what you're learning, but it might be down the road that something actually becomes clear to you. The Condomble herbalist that I mentioned said, it was said, if you're poked by a branch or you're brushed by a plant, it wants you to take a piece of it, and you should take a piece of it, and you might not even know what it is. You might not know what it's for. It might not be, just to recognize that you are becoming a part of the story of that place, right? You are a story of that place. So there's that. A great example, I think, a funny example, when I was teaching the Native American Religious Traditions class, an undergraduate class, and we were talking about place, and we were talking about all of these kinds of things. And it was a beautiful spring day, and we hated sitting inside, and it wasn't pandemic, so it didn't. And I decided to send them all outside. And I said, all right, you're going to go out and you're going to just pay attention. You're going to go find a place to sit, and you're just going to pay attention. And you're not going to try to interpret. You're just going to pay attention. So they all went out. I gave them 15 minutes, and when they trooped back in, and I was asking about their experiences and what happened. This one young woman said, "Well, it was really nice." She said, "Except the crows were just making so much noise. I couldn't concentrate. So I didn't get anything out of it." And I said, "Well, who was talking?" And she said, "Well, I couldn't hear anybody talking because the crows." And so I was able to say, the crows were talking, right? The crows had a lot to say. Now, you might not know what they were saying, and it might not even matter that you do know what they're saying, but you were giving them the respect to listen. And she said, okay, yeah, I can see that. And I could see that they were really mad. They were really mad at this kid that was like throwing rocks up, little pebbles at the tree. It wasn't even throwing it at them, but was throwing pebbles at the tree. I said, okay, you just heard something. Anyway, that's a kind of, funny way of saying it. But I think the question is, or I think my own answer is, it's up to us to start paying attention in different ways.
I want to thank you, Dr. Schneider, for a very rich evening. And thanks to all of the questions. I am so glad they came your way instead of mine, because clearly you have engaged our imaginations. At this point of the lectureship, if we were in person, I would be surreptitiously getting out a framed poster of your lecture. So we will get that to you. Think of this as a virtual handover.
Oh, good.
And we thank you once again for your time and your thoughts. Thank you for joining us tonight, all, and stay safe and be careful.